All right, I'm supposed to give this lecture for this talk in English. And what I was going to try to do is to tell you how we are using genetics to try to develop understanding of the function of the brain and diseases of the brain. And you have to keep in mind that the brain is an organ of consciousness, and consciousness has two major components, which is alertness that you lose and regain once a day, and most people lose when they begin to lecture about genetics. and then it's the content of consciousness, which are our thoughts and emotions. And keep in mind that our thoughts and emotions define us as a species, and define us as individuals of the species, but we haven't the faintest idea how the brain generates a thought. We don't have the faintest idea how the brain generates emotions. We do not even have adequate definitions of thoughts and emotions. And most of the diseases we are thinking about today are diseases that affect thoughts and emotions. So how are we going to study things that affect functions that we cannot even define? It's extraordinarily difficult. We have a tendency to think about the brain as something that transcends the biology. That is something mysterious, or at least the functions of the brain, the thoughts and emotions, that they transcend the biology. But they don't. They are simply the crowning duty of the biology. They are definitely rooted in the biology. Because keep in mind that the brain is formed from exactly the same information, same kind of information, as the rest of the organs. I mean, the kidney is an organ that makes piss, the brain is an organ that makes thoughts and emotions. And you have to keep in mind that we inherit the structure of the brain, and the brain is like all other organs. The function is dependent on the structure. So we inherit the function of our brain, we inherit a tendency to think in a specific manner, and the possibility exists that we can even inherit thoughts, which of course begins to throw questions at the concept of free will. But the diversity in the sequence of A's, B's, and T's in our genome is probably accountable for most of human diversity. But if it comes from more than human diversity, it accounts for the diversity in the entire biosphere. There is no life on Earth that is not based on DNA, and therefore the total diversity in the sequence of DNA in the world is accountable for everything that we call life. In that context, I like to show this picture of Walt Whitman, the 19th century American poet, whose most famous work was Legal Grass. And the differences between Legal Grass and Walt Whitman lie mostly in the differences in the sequences of A's, B's, and T's in the genome. And I would even argue that the reason that Walt Whitman wrote a poem about Legal Grass, and Legal Grass did not write a poem about Walt Whitman, the reason for that is going to be found in the differences in the sequences of A's, B's, and T's in the genomes. And it's interesting that what we call a selection, a positive selection, which is what has driven the evolution of life on Earth, that if what it means when we say that there is a positive selection for an attribute, or a positive selection for a variant in the genome that confers one as an attribute that is a positive selection, the only thing it means is that those who have that attribute have more children, more offspring than those who don't have. So what does the human brain, the brain that gave us the music of Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven, what does it have to do with the number of offspring? And actually, it does very little. And actually, evolution takes place through random change and then selection. There is a random mutations in the genome, and then there's a selection of attributes that allow us to adjust to an environment. The brain, however, is an instrument with which we cheat on evolution. It allows us to adjust to environment without going through cycles of random change and selection. And it's but what I'll be talking about, or focusing on for the rest of this presentation, is sort of normal human diversity, diversity in the risk of disease, response to treatment, diversity in the way in which we treat, and diversity in the way in which we depart from normative norms when it comes to treatment. And in that context, I'd like to show the picture of these identical twins who died at the age of 87 at the same time from the same disease. They are born with identical germline genome, and after 87 years of battling environmental influences, they died from the same disease at the same time. And you would probably argue that the reason is that they were both stupid enough to become Catholic monks, living on the same bad diet and in the same bad quarters. And I don't argue with that. I just insist that this environmental influence on the life imposed on them by the selection of becoming Catholic monks is under heavy genetic influence, because I think that their choice, in this case the choice of becoming a Catholic monk, is a consequence of the way in which the brain is genetically hardwired, and we will come back to that at the end of this presentation. But basically, when you're using human genetics to study either a disease or some human attribute, some physiological function, you work with two data sets. You work with a data set in diversity in sequence, a data set in diversity in phenotype. And by phenotype, I mean the human attributes, who we are. And then you're looking for non-chance association between data points in the two data sets using relatively simple statistics. And out of this, we and others have been finding basically two kinds of variants in the sequence. Remember, we have 3.5 billion, nucleotides in our sequence, and when I'm talking about variants, I'm talking about the products in the sequence that tend to differ between individuals, where one individual can have A and another individual can have C. And some of these are rare, some of these are common. The common ones that come with us out of Africa, Norway came out of Africa, or they have been under positive selection, and actually the common variants are accountable for almost all normal human diversity. The common variants confer a relatively small risk of disease, but they can be sufficiently common that they can have a confluence of variants that influence our risk of a particular disease. The rare variants disrupt the same physiological functions. And remember that rarity and novelty are synonymous in these kinds of genetics. If the variant is rare, it is relatively niche. One of the things that is important to keep in mind, that even though we inherit our genomes from our parents, we do not have only in our genomes variants that are also found in our parents. Each one of us is born with about 65 to 70 new variants. That is due to mutations that happened in our parents when they were either in our parents that were not transmitted into all of the somatic cells. They are present in the germ cells, in sperms, and the ova. And these new mutations are in many ways extraordinarily interesting because they account for a very large percentage of devastating diseases of early childhood. And you can basically understand they would have to be new because the devastating diseases of early childhood prevent the individual from having children. So they wouldn't occur unless we would be looking at something new that did not come from the parents. So not only do we have to account for the correlation between diversity in the sequence and diversity in phenotypes, risk of disease, and the performance of various organs, we also have to account for changes in the diversity in the sequence. And actually, a few years back, we showed that, we decided to study their new mutations. What is it that causes diversity in the rate of new mutation? Why is someone born with a lot of new mutations another person born with relatively few. And we, like everyone else, assume that there would be a lot of environmental influence in this, like cosmic radiation, etc. But what we discovered is that 97% of the diversity in the rate of new mutations is related to the age of the parent. The older the parent, the more new mutations are transferred over to the child. And most of that age-associated increase is due to the age of the parent. And that is relatively easy to understand because all of the eggs of the mother are formed when she is a fetus. But the sperms of the father continue to be generated throughout the reproductive life of the male. And every time a cell divides, like the spermatogonia that makes sperms, the DNA in the nucleus is duplicated. Even though the mechanism to duplicate DNA is very good, it is not error-free, and the errors in the duplications can cause mutations. So about 80% of the new mutations, age-related increase in new mutations comes from the father. And let's look at what that means. It means that a child that is conceived by a 40-year-old father has twice the number of new mutations as the child that is born is conceived by a 20-year-old father. And what makes that particularly interesting is that the child that is conceived by a 40-year-old father is about 2 to 3 times more likely to develop schizophrenia than a child that is born by a 20-year-old, conceived by a 20-year-old. And the same applies to autism. So when I was in medical school, I was told that the old mother was a particularly dangerous environment to her child. The fact of the matter is, however, that the only disease with an increased prevalence or increased incidence in the old mother are rare chromosomal disorders like Down syndrome. But in the case of the father, there are all kinds of diseases, schizophrenia, autism, all kinds of cancer, with higher incidence in a child that is conceived by an older father. And we actually did the systematic study of the impact of the old mother on the fate of the child. And there is hardly anything that is better for a child than being born to an old mother. The older your mother when you're born, the more education you get, the less likely you are of becoming alcoholic, the less likely you are of developing all kinds of cardiovascular diseases. So I think that we owe an apology to the old mother. For decades they've insisted that she is dangerous to the child. She is, however, extraordinarily good for the child. The old father, however, that's a different story entirely. So the ideal match for the well-being of society will be an old woman and a young man. I mean, this is a peculiar sense of humor from that. I'm describing to you a very, very important biological principle of the way in which we could improve. This would be the new eugenetics. But when we begin to think about the diseases of the brain, and when we end up having a significant problem even in the definition of the disease, because a disease is what we call it when there is an undesirable departure from the normative norm in physiological function. And the physiological function that is preferred in psychiatric diseases, the physiological function we know nothing about, we cannot even retire. And let me give you an example of how this even can change over time. This is a graph showing how smoking prevalence in Iceland has changed. The blue dot shows the smoking prevalence. However, the red dot shows the genetic risk of schizophrenia that accompanies the smoking. And what is remarkable about this, if you look at this graph, is that if you go from 1910 to 1980 and 1990, the probability, the genetic risk of schizophrenia of those who smoke has increased dramatically. And what does it mean? It means basically that smoking has become a pathological departure from the normal norm. It used to be the norm. So all of a sudden, we know that about 90 to 95% of schizophrenics smoke. And now we have basically demonstrated that with decreasing prevalence of smoking, it has become increasingly clearly a sign of such an aberration of behavior that we have to begin to look at it in many ways as many other signs of psychiatric diseases. Another example of the problems you have when you begin to look at, within parentheses, signs of psychiatric disease, is that there is a condition called oppositional defiant disorder. It is diagnosed in very young children. It is more heritable than any other psychiatric disease. And 65% of Icelandic prisoners in Icelandic prisons have been diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder. So all of a sudden, the inability to stay within the framework for law could be looked upon as a sign of a psychiatric disease, which puts us in a serious trouble when it comes to the ideas of how to deal with people who break the law. This is one of the things that we have been struggling with as society, is how to look at the addictive disorders. And there has been a tendency in a society to look at addictive disorders as sort of a bad behavior rather than a disease. But what I have here is data from Iceland where we look at the first, second, third, and fourth degree relatives, and up to fifth degree relatives of individuals who are either alcoholics, potheads, addicted to sedatives or amphetamines. And as you can see, in the first degree relatives, which is basically parents or siblings or children, the risk of becoming addicted is tremendous. Basically, if you have an alcoholic first degree relative, you're a little bit over 2 times more likely to become an alcoholic than the population average. When it comes to cannabis, it's almost 5 times. When it comes to amphetamines, it is 7 times. But then you may say, first degree relative is likely to live in the same place as you, so that this may be in large part the environment. But you can go up to a 5th degree relative, which is highly unlikely to live anywhere close to you, and they still have a greater risk than the average of societies, which is absolutely clear that addictive disorders are genetically conferred on you, like most other diseases. Let's then take a step and back and ask the question: if we are having difficulties approaching developing understanding of psychiatric diseases because of a lack of understanding of the very basic functions of the brain, such as thought and emotions. And what can we do about it? As I told you before, we haven't the faintest idea how the brain thinks, and we cannot even define thoughts. So how can one then do a systematic study of thoughts, trying to sort of get one's arms around the concept? One way is simply to submit a large number of people to tests of cognitive function, and then look for variants in the sequence that place them on a normal distribution curve, because every function, every biological function of man follows normal distribution except for lifespan. Otherwise we would have 150-year-old people amongst us. But all other functions of man follow normal distribution. The other is simply to take mutations or variants in the sequence that affect the risk of diseases that affect thought. and look at them. And what we did is that we took copy number variants, which is a specific type of mutations that increase the risk of schizophrenia by the factor of 10. Remember, schizophrenia has a population prevalence of about 1%. So those who carry these mutations have about 10% probability of becoming schizophrenic. That means that they have 10% probability or not. 90% of those who carry these mutations do not develop schizophrenia. And the question we asked is that what impact do these mutations have on thoughts, on cognition, on those who carry the mutations and do not develop schizophrenia? And remember, schizophrenia is first and foremost a disease of thought and emotion. So we recruited a large number of people carrying these mutations who were not diagnosed with schizophrenia, and what we showed is that these individuals, and those are marked by blue, that they have a departure from the normative norm in cognition. They think differently in the same categories as schizophrenic, although not quite as severely. And what does that mean? It means that it isn't that you develop schizophrenia and therefore you think differently. It means that you think differently and therefore you're at risk of the disease. So your thoughts are not inconsequential. Your thoughts today have an impact on the way in which you think tomorrow. It's interesting, at that time, when we did that study, when we published that study, it had been firmly established that you're more likely to find individuals who are creative in the families of schizophrenics. Shouldn't come as a surprise, because if you're in a family of schizophrenic, you're more likely to carry one of these variants, one of these mutations that make you think differently. And to be able to be creative, you have to think differently. What had not been established was whether you were more likely to find these creative individuals in families of schizophrenics because those families are more tolerant or thinking differently than other families, or whether creativity and schizophrenia is here biology. And to address that, we basically took all of the variants in the genome that affect the risk of schizophrenia, and we generated a risk score. The higher your score, the more likely you are of developing schizophrenia. And then we looked at this score in the association of Icelandic writers and painters and composers, etc. And we showed that indeed they have substantially higher risk score of schizophrenia than the population in general. So we had shown that schizophrenia and creativity share biology, which is interesting because it basically means that the attribute that gave us the music of Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven is an attribute that 1% of the population pays a high price for by developing schizophrenia. And it also underscores what we have all thought was reasonable over the centuries, that the genius and the crazy one are probably intellectually science twins, or like, very related to each other, because to be able to be a genius you have to be different. And indeed, we call those who are different in a little bit different way, we call them crazy. There was a little bit of a setback in this discovery of ours, because when we started to ask the question, what is creativity? One of the things that came up is that central to that is novelty seeking, all right? So what we did is that we took the same genetic score for schizophrenia and we demonstrated that the higher your genetic score for schizophrenia, the more likely you are for having child with one than one mate. So this is the aspect of creativity that my mother wouldn't have liked very much. This high score for schizophrenia that makes you more likely to be creative also is likely to make you more promiscuous. One of the things that is important to do once you begin to look at psychiatric diseases is look at the comorbidity with his classic diseases in other organs. For example, schizophrenics are very likely to develop lung cancer because 90 to 95% of them smoke. And then if you take body mass index, which is basically the measure of how obese you are, when you take all of the sequence variants that affect BMI, body mass index, it is very easy to show that you also associate with alcoholism, with smoking, with opiate addiction, etc. And so one of the things we did is that we took a polygenic score of the same type as we used before, polygenic score for schizophrenia. We took all of the variants in the genome that affect BMI, and we asked the question, what impact do they have on cognition? Do the variants in the genome that affect how fat you are, your body mass index, do they affect any function of the brain? I mean, the demonstration of how these variants that affect BMI also affect smoking, alcoholism, etc., basically point to the possibility that obesity may be a neurobehavioral disorder. And basically what I'm showing you here is the impact of this polygenic score for BMI that shifts you one standard deviation towards greater obesity, and we show that it has impact on basically all aspects of cognitive function. It decreases your verbal IQ, it decreases your performance IQ, it decreases your ability in the playmaking test, and it has an impact on your education in the direction that you have less education. So the higher polygenic score, the higher genetic risk score for obesity or BMI, the less is your ability to think. And what does that mean? Does it mean that obesity affects the function of your brain? No, that is not what it means. It means that the genetic abnormality in the function of the brain that makes you eat more affects other aspects of your thinking. And actually, if you then take the same score and you ask, does it affect any part of personality? Yes, it decreases the agreeableness of your personality. That's the only personality measure it could affect. If you then take a genetic score for education, genetic score for verbal and numerical recognition, the higher it is, the less is your BMI. So I'm going the other direction. The higher, if the genetic score makes your cognition better, you have less BMI. What is particularly interesting, if you then ask the question, what impact does the score for body mass index have on various biological features? The higher your genetic score for BMI, the younger you are when you have your first child, and the more children you have. So there's a positive selection for the genetic propensity to become obese. So we are becoming more obese by the generation, not just because of exposure to more nutrition, but the genetic propensity to become obese is under positive selection. And this is important because the higher your BMI, the less education you have, which means basically that there is a negative selection against education, and we looked at that direction. So basically it has been known for a long time that people with lot of education have fewer children than those with little education. But we did more than that. We took a polygenic score for educational attainment. We took all of the variants in the genome that affect, whether you obtain education or not. We generated a score out of it. The higher your score, the more likely you are of acquiring a lot of education. But we took those with high score who nevertheless have little education, and we showed that they have fewer children. So it isn't the education that deters you from having children, it is their genetic propensity to acquire education. So there's a negative selection against whatever attribute it is that allows you to acquire education, and we automatically assume that this meant that there was a negative selection against intellect. And I really like to talk about this because I could stand in front of an audience and say, I'm pleased to be the oldest man in the room, because the rest of you guys must be much more stupid. But when we started to dive into it, it really wasn't the case. Because when we took a polygenic score for intellect, that was also under negative selection, but when we corrected for education, that selection disappeared. So it turns out that there is a negative selection against an attribute that has nothing to do with intellect, that allows you to acquire education. So if you take the polygenic score for education and polygenic score for intellect, they always travel together. If one of them affects something, the other affects the same thing in the same direction, with one exception. The higher your polygenic score for education, the more likely you are of developing schizophrenia. The higher your polygenic score for intellect, the less likely you are of developing schizophrenia. So there is a negative selection against non-intellectual attribute that allows you to acquire education that is dangerous to your mental health. And basically, to cap it off, there is an assortative mating on the basis of education, which means that people mate on the basis of the education they have. People with the same level of education tend to mate. We show that there's also a assortative mating on the basis of intellect, but if you correct for education, it disappears. So when you add all of this together, it sounds as follows. There is an attribute that has nothing to do with intellect, that allows you to acquire education, that is under negative selection. It is dangerous to your mental health, and it is sufficiently obvious that people mate on the basis of it. And we haven't the faintest idea what this is. And that is really sad. I'm going to go back, I'm going to end by going back to these identical twins, these hapless identical twins who ended up spending their lives as Catholic monks and died from the same disease at the same time. And fascinating, because what they share is a genome that is identical, and they have shared this genome since their conception. And so for 87 years, plus 9 months, they have shared this genome. So for 88 years almost, they have been under enormous environmental influences, but still they die from the same disease at the same time. And remember that common complex diseases are defined as diseases with both genetic and an environmental component to risk. And I think to shed light on the way in which I think about it, I'm going to show you what we have done on the genetics of smoking behavior. So we have found now a very large number of variants in the genome that are such that if you have them and you smoke more than others. If you have them and you want to quit smoking, it is more difficult for you, etc. But lung cancer in Iceland is a pure environmental disease. 97.5% of those who smoke, they develop lung cancer, they smoke. They smoke for decades. Right? 14.5% of those who smoke for decades develop lung cancer. 97.5% of those who develop lung cancer smoke for decades. So without an environment we call tobacco smoke, you will not develop lung cancer. But you inherit a propensity to seek the environment. You inherit a propensity either to seek the environment or avoid it. So where is the line of distinction between nature and nurture? It doesn't exist. And the reason I emphasize this in a discussion of the genetics of function and dysfunction of the brain, that not only it is essential for us to develop better understanding of the physiological function of the brain, to be able to study the genetic studying the psychiatric diseases. Because without further understanding of the way in which the brain generates normal thought, abnormal thoughts, normal emotions or abnormal emotions, we will not be able to conquer psychiatric disease. Because psychiatric diseases, like all other diseases, are simply an expression of an abnormal biology, no matter how you turn it and twist it. And keep in mind when we begin to think about these diseases in the context of community and the context of culture, that the nature of the community and the nature of the culture is under tremendous genetic influences. But it's not only necessary for us when it comes to our desire to tackle psychiatric diseases, without understanding better how the brain works, we are not going to understand heart disease, obesity, diabetes, or cancer. So the brain, the brain is not just the most important of all of the organs. It could be argued that we are nothing but the brain, and the rest of our biology, the rest of our body is only to move the brain from point A to point B and allow the brain to take things in and get things out. And this might sound like a little bit of a bold statement by an eccentric geneticist, but we as a society have already embraced this idea because we have defined brain death. Individual who is brain dead, we usually turn off the respirator. But anyway, that's all I was going to say today. Thank you for listening.